There's something quietly terrifying about the thought of death, not just the fear of pain or the unknown, but the fact that everything, our dreams, relationships, memories, could all simply stop. For most of us, it's a thought we try to avoid. But for some people, like Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher, death wasn't a mystery to be feared. It was something to look at directly, because in doing so, we discover something deeper about how we're meant to live. Imagine sitting alone in your room one evening. The sun has just gone down, and the lights are off. There's a quiet hum in the air. You're scrolling on your phone, half aware of the silence around you, and suddenly, you receive a call from a friend telling you about the death of a person you know well. A thought hits you, not loud, not dramatic, but like a whisper in the back of your mind. One day, I will die too. How to deal with such feelings? What is the right way of seeing it? It's hard to discover that answer ourselves because it causes us anxiety. Feeling anxious and trying to find clarity altogether doesn't sound very easy. So, let's dive deep into it. Sometimes, without meaning to, we stumble into a thought that unsettles everything. One day, I will die. Not in some distant, abstract way, but really, truly, completely. And it's not the pain that terrifies. It's the ending. Everything I've known, my memories, my laughter, the people I love, will vanish like smoke in the air. This thought doesn't arrive with a warning. Everyone around you seems busy living, distracted by to-do lists and tiny frustrations. And you wonder, do they feel it too? Or is it just me, quietly afraid beneath the surface of things? You start to question everything. What's the point of trying so hard if death is going to erase it all? What meaning does success have when the finish line is a grave? Why love someone so deeply, knowing that time or fate will eventually pull you apart? It feels cruel, doesn't it, to care so much about this life, this fragile, fleeting thing, while knowing it can slip away without warning. You try to make sense of it, try to find something solid to hold on to, but the more you look, the more everything begins to blur. The rules, the goals, the roles we play, they start to feel like costumes in a play. No one remembers writing. You walk among people, smiling, pretending, working, and yet, beneath it all, you feel like you're floating in a strange kind of loneliness. Not the kind that comes from being unloved, but the kind that comes from not understanding what any of this is for. You try to tell yourself it's natural, that everyone dies, but the fear remains. Not because death is rare, but because it's personal. It's your ending. And somehow, that feels impossible to accept. So you push the thought away, distract yourself, look for answers in books, or beliefs, or other people. But nothing seems to quiet that whisper that lingers in the back of your mind. What if nothing means anything? What if I live, and love, and struggle, and it all disappears anyway? Learning the fear is the key. Fear fades when we begin to understand the thing we're afraid of. Think about a child who's scared of the dark. In their mind, the dark could hide anything: monsters, dangers, unknowns. But when the light is turned on, the fear disappears. Not because the room has changed, but because they can see. The same applies to us, even as adults. When we fear something, whether it's death, failure, or loneliness, it often isn't the thing itself we're afraid of. It's our lack of understanding about it. Death, in particular, creates this deep anxiety because it feels final, silent, and untouchable. We avoid thinking about it. We try not to bring it up in conversation. And that silence gives fear its power. But the moment we start learning about it, not just the physical fact of dying, but what it means, what it teaches us, how others have faced it, that fear begins to shrink. The more clearly we see something, the less room there is for imagination to turn it into something terrifying. It's like walking through a fog. The unknown blurs everything, and your mind starts filling the gaps with worst-case scenarios. But if you take a few steps forward, look a little closer, the fog begins to lift. That's what learning does. That's what philosophy does. It gives shape to what once felt shapeless. So when we study death, not with dread, but with the intention to understand it, it becomes less of a threat and more of a mirror. We stop asking, what if it all ends? And start asking, how do I want to live while it lasts? This shift is quiet. It doesn't scream, it doesn't preach. It just opens the door a little, enough for light to come in, enough for the fear to breathe and soften. And little by little, the thing we once ran from becomes something we can finally face. But all of this is something that is not new. Being born and dying are the events happening ever since the world started. And men before us had felt the same, and asked the same questions and found answers as well. And the first part of it was the discovery of existentialism. Existentialism invites us to face a profound truth. The world itself does not hand us meaning or purpose. Instead, it challenges us to find the quiet courage within, to create our own meaning through the choices we make every day. This philosophy asks us to become fully ourselves, not by following a predetermined path, but by embracing freedom with all its uncertainties and responsibilities. Even though death silently watches from the edges of our lives, existentialism teaches that this awareness doesn't weaken us. It deepens our experience and calls us to live more honestly, more authentically, and with a sense of urgency that honors the preciousness of each moment. It is, in essence, an invitation to live fully awake, choosing to be the authors of our own stories against the vast unknown. Sartre's philosophy on existentialism and death. Death has no meaning, and we create it through life. Jean-Paul Sartre believed that death in itself holds no meaning. It isn't a message from the universe, or a doorway into hidden wisdom. It's simply the point at which existence ends. For Sartre, we are not born with a built-in purpose, and death doesn't give us one either. We enter life without a manual, and it is only through the choices we make, the risks we take, the values we uphold, the truths we chase, that we slowly carve out a sense of who we are. In that view, death doesn't define life. Rather, life defines itself, moment by moment, through what we choose to become. Death, then, is just the absence of that becoming. Sartre would argue that trying to find meaning in death is like trying to hear music in silence. What matters is what was played before the silence came. And so, the meaning of our lives, if it exists, must be created while we're alive, through our freedom and responsibility, not discovered at the edge of death. Imagine an artist painting a canvas. There is no grand design waiting in the heavens to be revealed. It's up to the artist to choose the colors, the shapes, the rhythm of the strokes. Some people will create quietly, with love. Others will hesitate, erase, start over. But in every case, the painting only means something because of the time and intention poured into it. Death is just when the brush falls. It doesn't complete the painting. It simply ends the act of painting. Take someone who devotes their life to kindness, not because they believe they'll be rewarded after death, but because they choose to live that way, freely and fully. Or someone who leaves a violent past to build a life of peace, not because they're promised redemption, better, These people are Sartrean. They're not waiting for death to give their lives a moral or spiritual stamp. They're creating that meaning through what they do now, in their freedom. And that is where meaning lives, not in the silence that comes after life, but in the voice we use while we're still here. Death defines a limit, not a goal. Sartre didn't see death as something that gives meaning to life. He saw it as a limit, a boundary, a full stop, but not a destination or a lesson. Many people are taught to think of death as the final moment that explains everything, like a conclusion that ties the story together. But for Sartre, that's not how life works. A person's life doesn't suddenly become meaningful just because it ends. Meaning isn't something death hands us, it's something we must create during the moments we're alive. Death simply marks where the writing ends. It doesn't shape the story or decide what it meant. In that way, Sartre asks us to shift our gaze. Stop staring at death, waiting for it to teach us what matters. Instead, look at how you're living right now, because that's where the real shaping happens. Death will come eventually, but it won't tell you who you were. You have to do that part yourself while you're still breathing. Our responsibility makes death less terrifying. Sartre believed that our essence, who we truly are, is not shaped by how we die, but by how we choose to live. Death may be final, but it doesn't sum us up. That's because, for Sartre, we are not born with fixed identities. We are not fated to become someone. Instead, we're always in the process of becoming. Through every decision, every word spoken, and every silent refusal, what we are is a result of what we do. So when death arrives, it doesn't carry some ultimate truth about us. It simply stops the story where we left it. If someone dies suddenly, or painfully, or quietly, it does not make their life more or less noble. Sartre warns us not to give too much poetic weight to the moment of death, because it risks erasing the everyday reality of living, where meaning is actually made. Dying is just an event. Living is the act that counts. Imagine two people. One dies dramatically, in a moment that looks heroic, but their life before that was filled with cruelty, avoidance, or fear. Another dies unnoticed, quietly in a hospital bed, after decades of loving others, growing, struggling with honesty, and giving more than they took. Which life was fuller? Because it's not the final scene that defines the movie. It's everything leading up to it. A person is not just how they die. They are their gestures, their regrets, their small acts of courage, and their moments of truth. Sartre's philosophy is a reminder that you don't need to fear a meaningless death if you live a meaningful life. The goal is not to die beautifully, but to live consciously, to shape your identity through freedom, choice, and authenticity. When you do that, death becomes just a closing door, not a judgment. You've already told your story. Albert Camus' philosophy on existentialism and death. The absurd is born from death and the search for meaning. Camus begins with a feeling, a clash between what we long for and what the world offers. We crave answers. We want life to make sense. We want to believe that all our struggles, joys, and heartbreaks are leading somewhere. But then death shows up, cold, silent, final, and it refuses to explain itself. It doesn't wait for us to be ready. It interrupts stories without finishing them. That's where Camus says, the absurd is born, not in death itself, but in the contradiction between our deep hunger for meaning and the silence of the universe. We ask, why do we die? And the world answers with a blank stare. There is no ultimate reason, no script, no hidden reward for being good or kind. And yet, we still feel the need to search for something more. That tension, that ache between our longing and the emptiness of the answer. Imagine standing in front of a vast, silent sky after someone you loved has died. You ask the stars why, and they say nothing. That silence is painful. But Camus doesn't say we should run from it. He says we must face it. The absurd isn't a problem to be solved. It's a reality to be recognized. The moment we realize that life doesn't hand us meaning, and death doesn't reward us with understanding, we're standing at the edge of something terrifying, but also deeply honest. It's like waking up from a dream and seeing the world clearly for the first time. It hurts, yes, but it also means you're awake. We must imagine a life worth living, despite death. Camus doesn't offer false comfort. He doesn't pretend that death will make sense, or that everything happens for a reason. In fact, he begins with the honesty that life may not come with a meaning at all, and death only sharpens that realization. But instead of falling into despair, Camus takes a rebellious turn. He asks a radical question. What if we lived as if life were still worth it, even without ultimate meaning? What if, knowing that we will die, and that the universe offers no promise, we still chose to live with passion, care, and presence? That's where Camus finds his strength. Not in answers, but in defiance. He believes the very act of living in the face of death is an act of courage. It's saying, I know the end will come, but I choose to be here now, fully alive. We don't need to escape death to find joy. We just need to stop waiting for life to justify itself. This is why Camus uses the myth of Sisyphus, the man condemned to push a boulder uphill forever, as a symbol. At first glance, it seems tragic, but Camus flips the story. Sisyphus knows his fate, and still he pushes. He doesn't do it for reward or salvation. He does it because it's his rock and his struggle. That's the image Camus leaves us with. Not a person broken by death, but someone who embraces life on their own terms. In our daily lives, this might look like loving deeply, even though we know we'll lose people. Creating art, even if it might be forgotten. Laughing, helping, building, choosing, even when none of it is guaranteed to last. That's the heart of Camus' answer. Not to run from death, but to live so fully that even death cannot steal the meaning we gave to each moment. It's not about hoping for more time. It's about honoring the time we already have. Freedom comes when we accept death without resignation. Camus doesn't ask us to pretend we're not afraid of death. In fact, he acknowledges that fear is natural. It's part of being human. But he also warns us not to be owned by that fear. So many of us live half-lives, afraid to really choose, to really feel, or to really love, because in the background, we know it could all end. We protect ourselves from pain by numbing ourselves to joy. Camus saw this as a quiet form of resignation, a way of living already defeated by death, even before we've died. But what if, instead of surrendering to that fear, we simply accepted it? What if we made peace with the idea that death is part of the deal, and then chose to live not in its shadow, but in our own light? To Camus, true freedom begins the moment we stop bargaining with death, when we stop asking it to stay away until we're ready. When we stop imagining life as a waiting room for something better. Once we accept that death will come, and that it doesn't have to make sense, we are free to shape our lives without illusion. This is not a cold, hopeless kind of freedom. It's warm and intimate. It means we can laugh without guilt, cry without shame, and live without needing guarantees. It means our courage isn't built on denial, but on truth. Think of the artist who paints knowing their work may never be seen. Or the parent who loves deeply, knowing one day their child will face the world alone. Or the person who gets up after heartbreak and still chooses to trust. That is the quiet defiance Camus admired. That is what it means to be free, not because we escaped death, but because we stopped letting it define how we live. In the end, what Sartre and Camus both remind us is this: death is not the enemy, it is the backdrop that sharpens life's meaning. Existentialism doesn't offer us a map or comfort in illusions, but it gives us something braver, the chance to live fully, even without guarantees. Sartre says, we create meaning through how we choose to live. And Camus urges us to rebel gently against the absurd by embracing life anyway. And in that quiet defiance, we find freedom, not by escaping death, but by learning how to live deeply with it. Like and subscribe to be with us in this journey of knowing life better.